Hello, and welcome to the Geopolitics Explained podcast. We've recently been discussing the war in Ukraine. In these discussions, I've been stating that I believe we're currently in a stalemate, and any major change in this environment will come from dramatic, unpredictable shifts. Unfortunately, the timing of these potential shifts is difficult to predict. But in recent weeks, some geopolitical analysts have been discussing the potential for the formulation of a grander deal that could be unfolding in the background. This optimistic outlook could include an end to the conflict in Ukraine. To set the stage for this, in today's episode, we're going to look at previous geopolitical grand bargains before then exploring whether we find ourselves in an environment today where such a grand plan could realistically unfold. Now, the first important thing to note is that grand bargains are incredibly rare. Throughout history, there have been some examples, but they are few and far between. The first such example is the Peace of Westphalia. This is arguably Europe's first modern grand bargain, which ended the 30 Years' War. By the end, all nations that were fighting were exhausted, especially financially and demographically. The deal saw all nations recognise the sovereignty of other states, accept any religion that these nations chose, and made territorial adjustments across Central Europe. This deal arose because everybody involved saw peace as more preferable than continued fighting. In short, their incentives were aligned. Another example from Europe is the Concert of Europe. This unfolded in the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars. After just over 20 years of revolutions and wars, no major power wanted another continent-wide war. Also, many nations feared that the French could pursue expansion once again. And so, the victorious powers pursued a deal that would contribute to a durable peace. These decisions were made behind closed doors by a small group of powers, which included the Austrians, the British, the Russians, the French, and Prussian representatives. France accepted reduced borders, Russia gained influence in Poland, Austria took control of large portions of Italy, Prussia expanded to the west, and Britain secured maritime advantages. Nobody in this negotiation got everything they wanted, but everyone got something. Because of this, the great powers that made this deal were incentivized to pursue the deal, but any other nation that was not involved was not. The Polish, the Italians, the Germans, Belgians, and the Hungarians, among many other nationalist movements, saw this deal imposed upon them. This was a deal for the great powers, but not for other nations. But the great powers could impose this deal on the rest of Europe due to power imbalances between themselves and other smaller nations. We will come back to this very important point later on. Another form of partial grand bargain was the post-World War II negotiations. I classify this as a partial grand bargain because it didn't contribute to a lasting peace. It birthed the Cold War. Germany had been defeated, Britain was heavily weakened, and the United States and the Soviet Union emerged in the strongest positions. The Soviets had influence over Eastern Europe, while the birth of the United States as empire saw it gain influence in Western Europe. A split Germany marks the division of these two spheres of influence. The United States and the Soviets were incentivized to pursue this deal at the time, and other nations were too weak to argue. However, ideological differences saw the Cold War arise, leading to questions as to whether this was a failed grand bargain. The fourth such example is the Nixon-China opening. Nixon visited China in 1972, but this wasn't a global grand bargain, it was a strategic bargain. The United States wanted leverage against the Soviets due to the Cold War, while China was fearful of the Soviets themselves. A deal between the Chinese and the Americans saw both sides benefit. Despite ideological differences, both nations moved towards cooperation, with the United States also acknowledging the One China principle. Today, as we'll discuss in next episode, the One China principle remains a key geopolitical issue, especially if such a grand bargain was to be established today. But back in 1972, both the Chinese and the Americans saw the Soviets as the greater threat than each other, and so this strategic bargain succeeded. The final grand bargain that I'd like to discuss is the end of the Cold War. Now, the end of the Cold War is notable in the discussion of grand bargains because it's debatable if one existed. The Soviet economy was struggling internally. Eastern Europe was becoming difficult for the Soviets to maintain influence over, and due to their economic struggles, the Soviets sought integration with the West. The alleged bargain would see German reunification and Eastern European independence in return for a security order in Europe that Russia was happy with. Today, the security order and NATO expansion in Europe are the reasons that Russia states for its current unhappiness and for the war in Ukraine. The deal at the end of the Cold War was brought about by Russian internal weakness and a rise of a power imbalance with the United States. In their weakened state, the Soviets were incentivized to cooperate, hoping that it would save the Soviet Union. However, in the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, we entered into a unipolar world led by the United States. As a result, some in Russia, including Putin, who describes it as one of Russia's biggest mistakes in the 20th century, see this post-war environment as a failed grand bargain. So, even though some of these examples aren't global grand bargains, they are included because they will be relevant to the discussion based on our global environment today. Now that we've established these examples, what is the status of our current geopolitical environment? Does it possess any similarities to these historical examples, or are we living in a world where a grand deal is unlikely? If we look at all of these grand bargains collectively, they often emerge under the following three conditions. Firstly, the major powers are exhausted, or they are fearful of the costs of continuing competition or conflict. Secondly, the distribution of power between relevant geopolitical actors is clear. And finally, each major power believes that it would gain more from a deal rather than continuing competition or conflict. These three conditions can also be narrowed down to any relevant geopolitical actor being incentivized to pursue such a grand bargain. If we take our world today, I don't believe the superpowers are incentivized to pursue such a grand deal because none of these three conditions exist on a large enough scale. Russia still believes its war of attrition will eventually wear down Ukraine. China continues to pursue expanded influence in the Indo-Pacific and in global supply chains, while the United States attempts to reshape our geopolitical world with Trump's aggressive moves to build resiliency. In short, as long as the major powers believe they can improve their position through their current actions, this will remain the case. While competition and conflict remain, the incentives to create any form of deal remains limited. This is the first of many issues that I have with this idea surrounding a grand bargain potentially emerging today. We'll explore this exact issue and many others in more detail in next episode. Now, to conclude, when it comes to this idea of a grand bargain, nations need to be incentivized to sign up for such a deal today. They also need to be on board with the future world that would arise because of such a deal. Despite my belief that a grand bargain isn't imminent between the superpowers, we still need to consider what this potential future world could look like if a grand bargain did arise. From this scenario, we can then also paint a picture of why I believe this makes a grand bargain even more unlikely. And so, next episode on Friday, we're going to explore what the world could look like if such a grand bargain was established. Would this plan work, or would it lead to even greater issues than the geopolitical problems that we face today? It's these questions that we'll answer next time. That's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review on the podcast platform of your choice. It really helps out the podcast. I've been Dylan, and I'll talk to you next time.